You've done something your dog didn't understand. Maybe you left them at a shelter for a month while you sorted your life out. Maybe you stopped coming home as often as you used to. Maybe you handed them to someone else without warning and walked away. And when you came back, something was different. They were happy to see you, but something in how they looked at you had shifted. You told yourself animals don't hold grudges. You told yourself they don't work that way. They just live in the moment, move on, forget. So the question is, were you right? Do animals actually know when someone they trusted let them down? Or is that just your own guilt talking? The answer is more uncomfortable than most people are ready for. And it starts not with behavior, but with the brain. Let's start with what fairness detection actually looks like in animals, because most people picture it wrong. In 2003, primatologist Frans de Waal published a study in Science that changed how researchers thought about the moral lives of animals. A capuchin monkey was trained to exchange pebbles for food. When she received a piece of cucumber while watching another monkey receive a grape for the exact same task, she threw the cucumber directly at de Waal and rattled her enclosure bars. She didn't want better food. She recognized that something was wrong, and she was furious about it. De Waal called this inequity aversion. What he was really describing was an animal that understood fairness well enough to detect when it had been violated. In 2009, researchers at the University of Vienna ran the same experiment with dogs. Two dogs sat side by side and were asked to give a paw on command. One received food, the other received nothing. The unrewarded dog initially complied, but within a few trials, it stopped responding entirely and began avoiding eye contact with the researcher. Not with the other dog, with the researcher specifically. When tested alone with no comparison animal present, it kept working without complaint. The unfairness wasn't the absence of a reward. It was the presence of an unequal one. And the dog knew exactly where to direct its response. But detecting unfairness in a laboratory is one thing. What makes this harder to dismiss is what happens across time and across relationships that were supposed to mean something. Brian Hare, director of the Duke Canine Cognition Center, spent years studying how dogs respond to deception from trusted humans. A researcher would point reliably toward food containers over multiple trials, building genuine trust with the dog. Then in a single trial, the researcher pointed to an empty container. The dog followed the cue and found nothing. What happened next changes the conversation entirely. Dogs didn't just become more cautious about containers. They stopped following that specific researcher's cues in all subsequent trials, while continuing to follow other researchers who had been honest. They didn't generalize the deception to humans in general. They assigned it to one individual, and they remembered. The clearest evidence of what this looks like across years rather than trials comes from sanctuaries that receive animals from abusive situations. At the Elephant Sanctuary in Hohenwald, Tennessee, workers have documented consistent patterns in elephants arriving from circuses and logging operations. Animals that had experienced specific forms of handling, particular tools, particular voice tones used during coercive training, showed measurable stress responses when encountering those same cues years later, even from strangers who had never personally harmed them. The association wasn't with a face, it was with a method. An elephant named Tara, arriving after years in the entertainment industry, showed anxiety around any human holding a training hook, regardless of whether that person had ever touched her. The object carried the weight of everything that had been done with it. Over years of rehabilitation, the response diminished, but it had been there, encoded precisely, waiting. The most dramatic documentation comes from primate research. At the Gombe Stream Research Center in Tanzania, Jane Goodall's decades of behavioral records show that chimpanzees maintained highly specific responses to individual humans across years, responses that tracked the history of the relationship rather than simple familiarity. Chimpanzees subjected to medical procedures by specific researchers continued to avoid those individuals for years while remaining completely relaxed around other researchers who had been present but uninvolved. They weren't afraid of humans. They remembered which human had done something they hadn't chosen, and they kept that information current. So what is actually happening in the brain? Researchers at Emory University found that negative social experiences involving a trusted individual are processed through the hippocampus and the amygdala simultaneously. The hippocampus encodes the event. The amygdala tags it with threat. When both structures engage together, the memory consolidates faster, resists fading longer, and resurfaces more readily when related cues appear. A betrayal is neurologically harder to forget than a kindness. The brain treats it as survival-critical information. It files it differently from the start. Franz de Waal spent 40 years studying the moral emotions of primates. He was careful with his language in a way that made what he said more significant. He didn't claim animals have morality in the philosophical sense. What he said was that the building blocks of moral behavior, fairness detection, reciprocity, response to broken trust, are present in species that diverge from our lineage tens of millions of years ago. We didn't invent these responses. We inherited them from something much older than us. Here's what science can say with confidence right now. Inequity aversion has been documented in at least 15 species, including primates, corvids, dogs, and elephants. Threat-tagged social memories involving specific individuals persist across years in large-brained social animals. Animals distinguish between the individual who broke trust and others around them, which means they are not generalizing fear but assigning it precisely. What science cannot yet say is whether any of this involves something we would recognize as the feeling of betrayal. Whether there is a subjective experience of having been wronged, of something in the relationship being permanently different now. We don't have a way to measure that. Not yet. But consider this. In 2018, researchers at the University of Kyoto returned to the inequity aversion paradigm and added one variable. After the unfair treatment, the researcher tried to repair the relationship, offering preferred food, spending time near the animal, attempting to reestablish trust. Some animals accepted the repair within days. Others maintained their avoidance for weeks. The difference wasn't explained by the severity of the original unfairness. It was explained by the length and depth of the prior relationship. The animals who had the longest history with the researcher before the breach took the longest to return to baseline. They had more to lose, and apparently, they knew it. So go back to that moment, the shelter drop-off, the weeks you stopped coming home, the morning you walked out and didn't explain. Your dog was happy to see you when you returned, but something in how they looked at you had shifted. You told yourself you were imagining it. Maybe you were, but the research suggests that what you saw in their eyes wasn't nothing. It wasn't guilt inventing a response that wasn't there. It was an animal with a hippocampus that works like yours, an amygdala that tags significant experiences the same way yours does, and a memory system that was built over millions of years, specifically to notice when something that was supposed to be safe turned out not to be. Whether what they felt was anything like what you felt walking back through that door, nobody can say. But they noticed, and sometimes knowing that is enough.